The silence was a living thing on Caleb Thorne's land. It had weight and texture, a presence as real as the biting dust that coated his tongue or the shimmering mirages that danced on the horizon, promising water where there was only sun-scorched earth. It was a silence he had cultivated, a fortress built of solitude and sweat, its walls mortared with the ghosts of a life he had burned to the ground and left behind. His ranch was not a place of comfort. It was a penance, a sprawling purgatory of rock and sagebrush where a man could work until his bones ached too much to let him dream. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked soil and the weathered gray wood of the homestead, a structure that looked less built and more like it had simply surrendered to the landscape. Caleb himself was much the same. His face was a road map of every hardship, the lines around his eyes etched by 1,000 unforgiven suns, his mouth a grim, straight line that rarely softened. His hands, calloused and scarred, were instruments of labor, capable of mending a fence, birthing a calf, or steadying a rifle with equal, dispassionate competence. He moved with the economy of a man who never wasted a motion or a word, his world pared down to the essential: the health of his cattle, the depth of his well, and the formidable distance he kept between himself and the rest of the world. He was a man defined by his own isolation, a king in a kingdom of dust, and that was precisely how he intended to keep it. The arrangement had been an act of pure, grim pragmatism, a concession to a reality he could no longer ignore. He needed help, but he would not, could not, abide the noise and complication of another person. A wife, the advertisement had suggested, was a partner, a helper. He had sent the money and the letter not with hope, but with the weary resignation of a man buying a new plow. He expected a woman as weathered as his land, someone with strong hands and a silent disposition, a creature of practicality who understood that this was a contract, not a romance. The twice-weekly stagecoach was a plume of dust long before it was a vehicle. It crawled across the flats, a beetle disturbing the perfect, heat-blasted stillness. Caleb stood on the porch of the town's only general store, his shadow long and sharp in the late afternoon light. He tasted grit and impatience. The coach groaned to a halt, the horses blowing, their hides slick with sweat. The driver, a man named Jedediah, whose face was permanently stained with tobacco juice, grunted a greeting. The other passengers disembarked, a collection of dusty prospectors and a tired-looking family, all blending into the brown and gray palette of the town. Then she stepped down. The world seemed to fall silent, a different kind of silence than the one Caleb knew. This one was born of shock. She was a slash of impossible color against the monochrome landscape. Her dress was not the sturdy calico of a frontier woman, but a garment of deep blue silk that shimmered like a dragonfly's wing, its fabric whispering a language this dusty town had never heard. Her hair was a glossy black river, coiled in an intricate knot and pierced with a single pin of polished wood. Her face was pale, a delicate oval of porcelain in which were set eyes the color of dark, wet slate. She moved with a liquid grace that was utterly alien here, her small, slippered feet seeming to float above the filth of the street. She was not the sturdy, sun-browned woman he had been led to expect. She was a porcelain doll, a fragile ornament, completely and terrifyingly out of place. This was Mei Lin. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle and stood with a stillness that was both dignified and profoundly lost. Her eyes scanned the small assembly of gawking townsfolk before they settled on Caleb, holding his gaze with an unnerving directness. He felt a muscle jump in his jaw. This was not a helper. This was a liability, a catastrophe wrapped in blue silk. The agent who had arranged this, a man in a faraway city who communicated only through clipped, impersonal letters, had either made a monumental error or was a practitioner of some cruel, elaborate joke. He saw the whispers start among the townsfolk, their stares a mixture of suspicion and crude curiosity. They saw what he saw, a fragile thing that the land would chew up and spit out before the first winter snow. Caleb strode forward, his boot heels crunching on the hard-packed dirt. He stopped a few feet from her, a towering figure of grim functionality. The scent of her was faint but clean, something like night-blooming flowers, a scent that had no business being in this world of sweat, leather, and dust. "You are Mei Lin?" he asked. His voice was rust, a thing unused to foreman such questions. She gave a single, curt nod. Her gaze did not waver. "You are Caleb Thorne." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Her voice was low and clear, with an accent that was precise, every word a carefully chosen stone set in place. He gritted his teeth. The contract, the arrangement, it was a folly, a mistake of epic proportions. He had to undo it. "There has been a mistake," he said, the words blunt instruments. "You are not what was described. This is no place for you. The next coach leaves in 3 days. I will pay your passage back." He wanted to turn, to walk away, to erase this entire moment from the day. But her stillness held him. Her expression did not change, not a flicker of fear or disappointment or anger. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes seeming to see straight through the hard shell he presented to the world, to the hollowed-out man within. "There is no mistake," she replied, her voice as calm as a deep well. "I am here as agreed. The contract is paid. I will not be returning." His frustration hardened into a cold knot in his gut. He was a man who solved problems with action, not words. This problem, however, was wrapped in silk and possessed an unyielding dignity that he found both infuriating and disarming. He was trapped. The town was watching. His own rigid code of honor, a relic from his past life, would not allow him to simply abandon her on the street. With a final, sharp exhalation of breath that was part curse, part sigh of defeat, he grabbed her small bundle from her hand. It was surprisingly heavy. "The wagon is over here," he bid out, turning his back to her, already moving, expecting her to struggle to keep up, but her footsteps behind him were light and steady, a quiet, persistent rhythm that followed him out of the town and into the vast, waiting silence of his world. The fragile truce had begun, though neither of them knew it yet. It was a truce born not of agreement, but of the simple, unchangeable fact that for the next 3 days they were stuck with one another. The ride back to the homestead was a study in silence. Caleb drove the wagon hard, the wheels churning up clouds of ochre dust that billowed back, coating everything. He expected her to cough, to complain, to shield her face with a delicate hand. She did none of these things. She sat perfectly still on the hard wooden seat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. She watched the land not as a victim, but as a student, her eyes tracking the flight of a hawk, the shape of the distant, bruised purple mesas, the subtle shifts in vegetation that signaled the change in the soil. He felt her observation as a physical pressure, a silent questioning of him and the world he inhabited. It was unnerving. When they arrived, the homestead looked even more stark and desolate than usual. The 2 ranch hands, a lanky youth named Billy and a grizzled old-timer called Gus, stopped their work at the corral to stare. Their faces, already slack with the afternoon heat, went completely blank with astonishment, then slowly morphed into expressions of broad, disbelieving amusement. Caleb saw the joke forming in their eyes, and his temper, always simmering just beneath the surface, began to boil. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down, his movements stiff with anger. "Get her things inside," he ordered, his voice flat and dangerous. Gus, at least, had the sense to look away and nod, but Billy couldn't contain a low chuckle. Caleb's glare could have chipped stone. "Something funny, boy?" "No, sir, Mr. Thorne," Billy stammered, his grin vanishing. "Just didn't expect that." Mei Lin descended from the wagon without waiting for assistance. She moved with that same disconcerting grace, her silk dress a whisper of sound in the dusty air. She ignored the men, her attention focused on the house, the barn, the layout of the ranch. Her quiet assessment of his home made Caleb feel strangely exposed, as if she were tallying up every flaw, every sign of neglect born from one man trying to do the work of three. The next day, the test came. It was not a test Caleb devised, but one that arose organically from the crude assumptions of his men. In the morning, he found her not in the house, where he had gruffly deposited her, but in the kitchen, which was now cleaner than it had been in years. The air, which usually smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease, was filled with the aroma of something savory and unfamiliar. A pot of congee simmered on the stove, and she had found his meager supply of dried herbs and somehow transformed them. She had already eaten, and a bowl was set for him. He ate it standing, the warm, simple food a strange comfort that he resented. It was a gesture of domesticity he had not asked for and did not want. Later, he was in the corral, working with a fiery young gelding that had already thrown Billy twice. The horse was a bundle of raw nerve and muscle, fighting the bit, rearing, its eyes rolling with panic. It was a battle of wills, and Caleb, though patient, was beginning to tire. Gus and Billy watched from the fence, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. It was then that Mei Lin emerged from the house. She had changed out of the blue silk dress and now wore a pair of dark, loose-fitting trousers and a simple tunic. Clothes that were practical yet still utterly foreign. She walked to the corral fence and watched, her expression unreadable. Billy, emboldened by what he saw as the absurdity of the situation, called out to her. "Careful there, ma'am. Diablo's got a mean streak. Not exactly a lady's pony." He laughed, a loud, braying sound. Maylene's gaze shifted from the horse to Billy. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned her eyes to Caleb. "I would like to ride," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried with perfect clarity over the snorting of the horse and the creak of the leather. The laughter that followed was explosive. Gus slapped his knee, a wheezing cackle escaping his chest. Billy howled, holding onto the fence for support. The sheer audacity of the request struck them as the funniest thing they had heard all year. A woman like her, a fragile doll from some far-off land, wanting to ride Diablo? It was a joke. Caleb felt a surge of hot embarrassment. He wanted her to retreat, to go back inside and hide. He wanted to silence his men. "This ain't a park ride," Caleb said, his voice low and strained. He was trying to warn her, to save her from humiliation. "I know," she said, her eyes never leaving his. There was no pleading in them, no hint of ego. There was only a calm, unwavering certainty. "Let me ride the horse." Something in her tone stopped him. It was the same quiet authority he had heard when she told him she would not be returning. A part of him, the part that was weary of fighting the horse and tired of his men's idiocy, decided to let this play out. It would be a harsh lesson, but a quick one. It would prove his point more effectively than any argument. He would show her, and his men, exactly how unsuited she was for this life. Then she would have to accept his offer to send her back. "Fine," he growled. "He's all yours." He swung down from the saddle, leading the still skittish horse toward the gate. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Billy and Gus exchanged gleeful, expectant looks. This was going to be a show. Gus opened the gate, and Maylene slipped inside the corral. She did not approach the horse immediately. Instead, she walked the perimeter, her movements slow and deliberate, letting the animal watch her. She made no sudden gestures. She began to speak to it, a low, crooning sound, the words in a language Caleb did not understand, but the tone was universal. It was calm, soothing, and utterly without fear. The horse, which had been dancing and pulling against Caleb's hold, began to quiet. Its ears, which had been pinned back in agitation, flickered, then swiveled toward her. She came closer, holding out a hand, letting the gelding scent her. He snorted, a puff of hot air, but did not pull away. She stroked his neck, her small hand moving with a firm, confident pressure. The tension in the horse's powerful muscles seemed to melt away under her touch. The laughter from the fence had long since died. Billy and Gus were now watching with their mouths slightly agape. Caleb stood frozen, the lead rope slack in his hand. He had never seen anyone gentle a horse so quickly, so completely. With a smooth, fluid motion that seemed to defy gravity, she gathered the reins and swung herself into the saddle. She was impossibly light, settling onto the horse's back without a jolt. For a moment, Diablo tensed, his old instincts flaring. He took a few bucking steps, a half-hearted attempt to unseat this strange new rider. But she moved with him, a part of him, her balance perfect, her hands light on the reins, given and taken with an expert's touch. She did not fight him. She flowed with him. And then it was over. The horse stood still, breathing deeply, and then, at a slight pressure from her heels, began to walk, then trot, then canter around the corral in a perfect, graceful circle. She was magnificent. She and the horse were one entity, a seamless union of human will and animal power. She urged him into a gallop, and they flew across the dusty enclosure, a whirlwind of grace and speed. She rode not like a homesteader's wife, but like a warrior, her back straight, her focus absolute. The sight struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He had judged her. He had dismissed her. He had looked at the silk and the porcelain skin and seen only weakness. He had been a fool. He had been utterly, profoundly wrong. She brought the horse to a gentle stop in the center of the corral, dismounted, and handed the reins back to Caleb. The animal was calm, its hide gleaming with a healthy sweat, its eyes clear. It nuzzled her shoulder. "He is a good horse," Maylin said simply, as if she'd done nothing more remarkable than fetch a pail of water. He was just afraid. She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving 3 men standing in stunned, absolute silence. The fragile truce was over. In its place, something new and unsettling had begun to grow, a seed of grudging, astonished respect. Caleb watched her go. The image of her riding burned into his mind. He did not yet know who this woman was, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him that she was far more than she appeared, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of his life felt less like a fortress and more like an empty room, waiting to be filled. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. The mockery from Gus and Billy evaporated, replaced by a wary, almost fearful respect. They gave her a wide berth, speaking to her only when necessary, their words clipped and polite. Caleb found himself watching her constantly. The quiet cohabitation was a period of intense observation for him. Dialogue remained sparse, almost non-existent, but her actions spoke a language he was beginning to understand. She was a study in efficiency. She wasted nothing. Not a drop of water, not a scrap of food, not a single motion. She repaired his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She took the neglected patch of dirt behind the house that his own mother had once tried to turn into a garden, and began, with painstaking effort, to clear it of rocks and weeds. She moved about his space, his fortress of solitude, with a quiet purpose that did not ask for permission. She was not invading his life. She was simply occupying the empty spaces within it. One evening, he came in late from mending a fence line on the far pasture. He was bone-weary, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in the marrow. The smell of wood smoke and roasted meat met him at the door. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, chasing the chill from the room. Mei Lin sat at the small table, cleaning his rifle with a focus and expertise that stunned him. The weapon was completely disassembled, the metal parts laid out on a clean cloth. Her slender fingers moved with practiced precision, wiping down each component with an oiled rag. He stopped in the doorway, silenced by the sight. It was an act of profound intimacy, to care for another man's weapon. It was a task he had never entrusted to anyone. She looked up, her expression calm. "The firing pin was sticking," she said, her voice matter of fact. "Dust from the plains. It gets into everything." She began to reassemble the rifle with the same swift competence, the pieces clicking together with a satisfying finality. She worked the lever, the action smooth as silk. She laid the finished weapon on the table. "It is clean now." He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He sat down at the table and she served him a plate of stew. It was made from jackrabbit and the tough roots she had foraged, yet it was the most flavorful meal he had eaten in years. They ate in their customary silence, but tonight it felt different. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers, but a shared, comfortable quiet. He was beginning to realize that her silence was not one of emptiness, but of depth. She was a woman who kept her own counsel, who observed everything and revealed only what was necessary. His initial assessment of her as a fragile liability seemed like a memory from another man's life. This woman was a survivor. She was as resilient and formidable as the harsh land itself. The external world intruded upon this fragile piece a week later. Caleb saw the dust cloud from a mile away, too large for a single rider, too organized for stray cattle. It was a group of men riding hard. He felt the old familiar tension coil in his gut. He took his newly cleaned rifle from its pegs by the door and stepped onto the porch. Mei Lin came to stand in the doorway behind him, her presence a silent, steadying weight at his back. The riders reined in before the homestead, their horses churning the yard into a mess of dust. At their head was Silas Croft, a man who was poison to this land. Croft was a land baron, a vulture who had gotten rich by buying up failing ranches for pennies on the dollar, usually after his own men had mysteriously cut their fences or fouled their wells. He was a man whose greed was as vast and empty as the plains themselves. He was dressed in a fine black coat, even in the blistering heat, a stark contrast to the dusty, functional attire of his hard-faced hired guns. Croft's eyes, small and porcine, swept over the ranch with undisguised contempt before landing on Caleb. "Thorne," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality, "still trying to scratch a living out of this godforsaken rock pile, I see." "It's my rock pile, Croft," Caleb replied, his voice level. The rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm. "What do you want?" Croft's gaze slid past Caleb to Mei Lin, who stood half hidden in the shadow of the doorway. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He looked her up and down with a blatant, insulting appraisal. "Well, well, I see you've acquired some exotic decoration for the place. Didn't take you for a man with such expensive tastes, Thorne. Where'd you order her from?" Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "That's my wife," he said, the words coming out hard as pebbles. The lie was automatic, a shield thrown up without thought. To call her a mail-order bride, a part of a contract, would have been to hand Croft a weapon. To call her his wife was to draw a line in the dust. Croft laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Your wife? A man can't even water his own cattle, and he takes a wife he can't afford to dress. You're a fool." The false friendliness vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory gleam. "I'm here to repeat my offer. $500 for this whole spread. That includes the land, the house, the cattle, and your permanent disappearance from this valley." "That's a generous offer, considering your well is going to run dry by the end of the summer." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Caleb's well was the deepest and most reliable in the region, fed by an underground spring. It was the reason Croft wanted the land so badly. "The land's not for sale," Caleb said. "Everything is for sale, Thorne," Croft sneered. "It's just a matter of price, or persuasion." He gestured vaguely with his riding crop toward the small herd of cattle grazing in the near pasture. "Shame if something were to happen to your stock. A fire, maybe, or they could just wander off. Fences break." The threat was naked. Stripped of all pretense, it was a declaration of war. Croft's men shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their holsters. They were watching him, gauging his reaction, but Caleb's attention was on Mei Lin. She had not flinched. She had not retreated. She stood her ground, her gaze fixed on Croft, her expression one of cold, analytical disdain. She was not looking at him as a threat, but as a problem to be solved, a piece on a board to be countered. "You've said your piece, Croft," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "Now get off my land." For a long moment, the tension was a physical thing, a stretched wire that hummed in the air. Then Croft shrugged, his smile returning. "Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when you've got nothing left but dust and regrets." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed, their departure as arrogant as their arrival. They rode off, leaving a trail of dust and the lingering poison of their threats. Caleb stood watching until they were specks on the horizon. The silence that returned was not the peaceful quiet of before. It was heavy, filled with menace. He turned to Mei Lin. He expected to see fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw a cold, hard fire. "They will not stop," she said. It was not a guess. It was a statement of certainty, a tactical assessment. He knew she was right. The shared crisis had begun. It was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. The attack came 2 nights later. There was no moon, only a blanket of stars scattered across an ink-black sky. The air was cool and still. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a smell, the sharp, acrid scent of smoke where there should be none. Caleb was out of his bed in an instant, pulling on his boots, his mind already racing. He grabbed his rifle and burst out of the house. On the western ridge, an angry orange glow painted the underside of the sky. The dry grasslands, cured to tinder by the summer sun, were on fire. "Gus! Billy!" he roared into the night. Lights flickered on in the bunkhouse, but as Caleb's eyes adjusted, he saw the second part of the attack. A dark, moving mass was pouring out of the northern pasture. Croft's men had cut the fences. They were stampeding his herd, driving them directly toward a series of treacherous canyons on the far side of his property. The fire was a diversion, a brilliant and cruel one, designed to draw his attention while they stole his livelihood. For a moment, despair, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He was one man. He could fight the fire or save the cattle. He could not do both. He would lose everything. Then Mei Lin was beside him, not in a nightgown, but in her practical trousers and tunic. In her hands she held a coiled lariat and a bridle. Her face, illuminated by the distant, flickering firelight, was a mask of calm, intense focus. "You cannot fight both," she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic in his chest. "So we will." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, the roar of the approaching fire growing louder. "Gus and Billy are useless with fear," she stated, not unkindly, but as a simple fact. "They will beat at the fire with blankets and waste their energy. You know this land. You will ride ahead of the fire. Find a place for a break. A rock slide, a creek bed. Use dynamite if you have it. You will stop the fire. And the cattle?" he shot back, his voice raw. "They'll be halfway to Mexico by then." "No," she said, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "They will not. I will bring them back." He stared at her. The idea was insane. One woman turning a panicked herd in the dead of night? It was impossible. But then he remembered the way she had ridden Diablo, the absolute mastery she had displayed. He saw the unwavering certainty in her eyes. He had a choice: trust in his own failing plan and lose everything, or trust in this enigmatic woman who had shattered every one of his expectations. It was not a choice at all. "The dynamite is in the shed," he said, the decision made. "There's a dry wash a mile east of here. It might work as a fire break." "Go," she commanded. She was already moving toward the corral, where Diablo, sensing the panic in the air, was pacing nervously. She spoke to the horse in that same low, soothing tone, and he calmed instantly under her touch. She bridled him with swift, efficient movements, then vaulted onto his bare back, a warrior queen preparing for battle. Caleb sprinted for the shed, grabbing the dynamite and blasting caps. He saddled his own horse, his movements frantic but sure. As he mounted, he saw her, a silhouette against the fire, galloping toward the sound of the stampeding herd, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. He offered a silent, desperate prayer and spurred his horse toward the flames. The next few hours were a blur of smoke, heat, and brutal, back-breaking labor. The fire was a living dragon, hissing and roaring, devouring the dry grass with an insatiable hunger. Caleb rode like a madman, the heat scorching his face, the smoke stinging his eyes and lungs. He reached the dry wash, a deep scar in the earth, and knew it was his only chance. Working with frantic haste, he planted the dynamite charges along the near edge, laying the fuses. He worked by the light of the inferno, the sweat pouring off him, his muscles screaming in protest. Behind him, he could hear the panicked shouts of Gus and Billy as they flapped uselessly at the edges of the blaze. He lit the fuses and galloped back to a safe distance. The explosions ripped through the night, a series of deafening cracks that threw dirt and rock high into the air. The concussion wave hit him like a physical blow. The blasts deepened the wash, throwing up a wall of fresh, cool earth. The fire reached the break and paused, licking at the bare dirt, hungry and thwarted. For a moment, it seemed to hold. Then, slowly, deprived of fuel, the line of flames began to die down. It was not out, but it was contained. Panting, exhausted, Caleb slumped over his horse's neck. He had done his part, but a cold dread filled him as he turned his gaze to the north. There was only darkness and silence. No sound of cattle, no sign of Maylene. He had sent her on a suicide mission. The guilt was a physical sickness. He had traded his land for her life. He urged his weary horse into a trot, riding toward the direction the herd had gone, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He rode for what felt like an eternity, calling her name into the oppressive darkness, his voice hoarse. He found the cut fence, the tracks of dozens of riders and hundreds of panicked cattle. He followed the trail, his hope dwindling with every step. Then he heard it. A low sound, far off, the gentle lowing of calm cattle. He spurred his horse onward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He topped a small rise and saw them. The entire herd, hundreds of head, were gathered peacefully in a small, box-ended canyon. They were not scattered. They were not lost. They were contained. And at the mouth of the canyon, sitting motionless on Diablo's back, was Maylene. She had done it. She had done the impossible. He rode down to her, dismounting before his horse had even stopped. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes torn. There was a dark stain spreading on her left sleeve. Blood. "You're hurt," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and fear. "It is nothing," she said, her voice strained. One of Croft's men stayed behind. A rear guard. He was not expecting me to come from the side. She swayed in the saddle, and he reached up, catching her as she slid from the horse's back. She was impossibly light in his arms, but her will was made of iron. "How?" he asked, his voice full of awe. "How did you do this?" She leaned against him, her strength finally failing. "They drove them in a straight line," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. "Panicked animals are predictable. I did not try to stop them. I rode the flank, pushed them, turned the lead steer a few degrees at a time. I let them think it was their idea to run into this canyon. It was brilliant. It was the kind of tactical thinking he associated with generals, not with whoever she was." He helped her to the ground, gently tearing the sleeve of her tunic. It was a clean gunshot wound, straight through the fleshy part of her arm. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was not fatal. He tore a strip from his own shirt and tightly bandaged the wound. His hands, usually so rough, were surprisingly gentle. Their faces were inches apart. In the faint pre-dawn light, he could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also the fierce, unyielding strength within them. In that moment, the transactional arrangement, the lie he had told Croft, all of it burned away, consumed by the fire and the crisis of the night. This was no longer a contract. This was a partnership, forged in chaos and sealed in shared survival. He had fought for his land. She had fought for their home. The final confrontation did not wait for dawn. As the first pale fingers of light crept over the horizon, revealing the blackened, smoking scar of the firebreak and the miraculously saved herd, they appeared. Silas Croft and a dozen of his men crested the ridge, their rifles ready. They had expected to find a ruined man in the ashes of his life. Instead, they found Caleb Thorne standing beside a contained herd, a wounded woman at his side, his rifle in his hands, and a look of cold fury on his face. Croft's face contorted in disbelief, then rage. The plan had failed. The subtlety was over. "Thorne," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet morning, "you are a stubborn cockroach. I should have just burned you out from the start." He raised his rifle. "This is my valley, my water. You have nothing." "He has me." Mei Lin's voice, though quiet, was sharp as glass. She had pushed herself to her feet, her injured arm held tight against her body. She looked at Croft not with fear, but with a look of profound pity, the look a master chess player gives an opponent who has just made a fatal blunder. Caleb stood slightly in front of her, a human shield. "This is over, Croft," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Ride out now, and I might let the sheriff handle it." Croft laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The sheriff? He works for me. Everyone works for me. This is the end of the line for you." He gave a sharp nod to his men. "Kill them. Burn the rest." But before the first shot could be fired, Mei Lin spoke again, her voice ringing with an authority that made every man pause. "You have 12 men, Mr. Croft. 3 are on the ridge to your left, exposed. 4 are clustered behind you, an easy target. Your other 5 are too far back to be effective in the first volley. You have placed yourself at the front, a perfect target for a man who can hit a running coyote at 200 yards. She paused, letting her words sink in. "My husband is such a man." The way she said, "my husband," sent a jolt through Caleb. It was no longer a lie of convenience. It was a claim, a statement of allegiance. "You will lose at least half your men before you can take 2 steps. You will be the first to die. This is not a battle. It is a poorly conceived execution. Your own." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces of Croft's men. They looked at their positions, then at Caleb, then at this strange, calm woman who spoke of death with such chilling precision. Her tactical breakdown was flawless. She had seen the entire battlefield in a single glance. "She's bluffing," Croft roared, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's just a woman." "My father was General Lin of the Emperor's Northern Cavalry," Mei Lin said, her voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "He taught me 2 things. The first is that all horses understand the language of respect. The second is that all foolish men who overestimate their own strength die in the dirt, far from home. He trained me to see the shape of a battle before the first arrow's loosed. I see the shape of this one." She met Croft's eyes. "You have already lost." The great unmasking was complete. She was not just a mail-order bride, not just a survivor. She was the daughter of a warrior, trained in strategy and tactics, a mind sharpened for conflict. This was her hidden depth, the secret strength she had kept veiled behind her quiet dignity. The standoff stretched for a heart-stopping eternity. Croft's men were no longer looking at him for orders. They were looking at each other, their bravado evaporating in the face of such unshakable certainty. They were hired guns, not fanatics. They were paid to intimidate and bully, not to die in a pointless slaughter. Caleb did not take his eyes off Croft. He saw the man's rage fighting with his instinct for self-preservation. In that moment, Caleb knew what he had to do. It was not enough to win. He had to break him. He raised his rifle in a smooth, unhurried motion. He did not aim for Croft's chest. He aimed for the ornate silver buckle on the man's gun belt. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound shockingly loud in the stillness. Croft screamed, not in pain, but in shock as his gun belt, the buckle shattered, fell to the ground, taking his pistol with it. It was an impossible shot, a display of skill so profound it bordered on supernatural. It was a statement. I can take your life whenever I choose. That was the end. The spell was broken. Two of Croft's men threw down their rifles. Another wheeled his horse and galloped away. The rest looked at their disarmed, humiliated leader, and the fight went out of them completely. They had followed a tyrant, but they would not die for a fool. Croft stared at his fallen gun, his face a mask of apoplectic fury and utter defeat. He looked at Caleb, then at Mei Lin, this impossible woman who had unraveled him with words, and this impossible man who had disarmed him with a single bullet. He was beaten, physically and morally. Without another word, he scrambled onto his horse and fled, his remaining men trailing behind him like whipped dogs. Silence descended once more, but this time it was a silence of victory, of profound, shuddering relief. Caleb lowered his rifle, the tension draining out of him so fast he felt dizzy. He turned to Mei Lin. She was looking at him, her dark eyes filled with an emotion he could not name. He saw the blood on her sleeve again, a stark reminder of the price of their victory. He stepped toward her, his body aching, his mind numb. He reached out and gently touched her uninjured arm. "Mei Lin," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had said her name with anything other than frustration. She leaned into his touch, her body trembling slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Caleb," she whispered back. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment. He saw the pain she had been holding back. He carefully scooped her up into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her toward the homestead, his steps slow and steady. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the land, their land. The battle was over. In the quiet of the aftermath, as he tended to her wound with clean bandages and quiet focus, a new understanding settled between them. Words were not needed. They had been tested by fire and violence, and they had not broken. They had forged a partnership, a bond stronger than any contract, deeper than any spoken vow. They had found in each other the missing piece of their own solitude. Weeks bled into a month, and the harsh land began to heal. The scar from the fire was still visible on the western ridge, a dark reminder of the night they had almost lost everything, but new shoots of green were already pushing their way through the ash. The rhythms of the ranch settled into a new, peaceful cadence. Caleb, Gus, and Billy worked from sunup to sundown, repairing the fences, tending the herd, and rebuilding what had been damaged. But the spirit of the work was different. The grim, solitary toil had been replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Mei Lin, her arm healed to a thin, pale scar, brought her quiet order to every corner of their lives. The garden she had started behind the house was now thriving, a defiant patch of green in the dusty brown landscape, producing strange, flavorful vegetables that found their way into their evening meals. The homestead itself felt different. It was cleaner, brighter. There were curtains on the windows sewn from old flour sacks, and a small pot of resilient wildflowers sat on the table. It was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a home. One cool evening, after the work was done, Caleb found her by the corral, watching Diablo. The horse, once a creature of fire and panic, was now as gentle as a lamb with her, nuzzling her hand as she fed him a piece of dried apple. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, and the light caught in her dark hair. Caleb came to stand beside her, leaning against the top rail of the fence. For a long while, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the horse and the dying light. "The last of the fence posts went in today," he said, his voice quiet. "The north pasture is secure again." It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like more. It was an affirmation of their victory, a testament to their shared labor. "It is a good fence," she replied, her gaze still on the horse. "It will hold." He looked at her strong, delicate profile against the twilight sky. He thought of the woman in the blue silk dress who had stepped off the stagecoach, a creature so alien to his world. And he thought of the warrior who had stared down a dozen armed men and broken them with her will. They were the same person. He had just been too blind to see it. He had built his life on the idea that he needed no one, that self-reliance was the only true virtue. He had been wrong. His solitude had not been strength. It had been a prison of his own making. She had not just saved his ranch. She had saved him from himself. "Sheriff Brody rode out from town yesterday," Caleb said, breaking the silence again. "He had some news." He paused. "Croft is gone, sold his holdings to a company from back east. He left the valley for good. His men scattered." Mei Lin turned her head to look at him then. Her dark eyes searched his face. "Are we safe now?" "Yes," he said. "We're safe." He took a breath, the words he needed to say feeling heavy and clumsy in his mouth. "The contract, the arrangement we had, it was for a helper, a housekeeper." He looked down at his scarred hands, then back at her. "That's not what this is. Not anymore." She waited, her patience a calm, deep pool. "This is your home, Mei Lin," he said, the words finally finding their way out. "If you want it, your garden, your horse." He gestured to the vast, quiet landscape spreading out before them. "Your land. Our land." A small, slow smile touched her lips for the first time since he had met her. It transformed her face, softening the dignified lines and lighting a warmth in her eyes that stole his breath. "I know," she said softly. It was not an acceptance of his offer. It was a statement of a truth she had known long before he had. This was her home. He was her home. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, an admission of a feeling he did not have the words to name. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment. In that quiet, understated moment, a commitment was made. It was not a promise of forever spoken in flowery words, but a silent, shared understanding, as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. They were two solitary souls who had found, in the heart of an unforgiving wilderness, an unlikely sanctuary in each other. Together they would build a future, one repaired fence, one planted seed, one shared sunset at a time. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of peace. A home, they were both learning, was not just a plot of land or a roof over your head. It was the quiet presence of another person standing beside you, watching the sun go down, knowing that you were no longer facing the darkness alone. It was a partnership forged in fire, a bond built on unspoken respect, and a love that grew, quiet and steady, in the most unlikely of places. If you stayed with me all the way through this story of Caleb and Mei Lin, thank you. Your time and attention are the greatest compliments you can give. If their journey from strangers to partners resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button. It truly helps more than you know. And if you want to be sure you do not miss the next story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Until then, Take care of yourself and each other.